$18. It isn't enough to change a life, but it's exactly enough to buy 3 days of generic mac and cheese and a loaf of cheap bread. When Arthur shoved his last few crumpled bills into the hands of a shivering, stranded woman in an alleyway, he didn't feel like a savior. He felt like a fool who just doomed his young son to a weekend of hunger. He never expected the convoy of 5 armored SUVs that completely surrounded his crumbling apartment building the very next morning. Rain in November doesn't wash things clean. It just makes the grime stick. Arthur wiped a smudge of grease off his jacket sleeve, standing under the flickering neon sign of the corner mart. His work boots leaked. The right one had a hairline fracture right across the sole, soaking his sock in freezing, oily puddle water. Inside his pocket, his calloused fingers traced the familiar, jagged edges of 3 $5 bills and 3 ones. $18. He had done the math 6 times since leaving the construction site, where the foreman had handed him a pink slip instead of a full week's pay. $18 was the exact distance between tonight and Thursday. Thursday was the day the neighborhood food bank opened. Until then, it was just him, his 6-year-old son Toby, and whatever empty calories he could stretch across 72 hours. He was about to pull the heavy glass door of the mart open, mentally preparing for the smell of stale coffee and rolling hot dogs, when he heard the ragged, wet coughing from the alleyway next to the dumpsters. Arthur froze. He didn't want to look. He had Toby waiting at Mrs. Higgins's apartment downstairs. He was already 20 minutes late. He didn't have the time, the energy, or the emotional bandwidth for a stranger's crisis. People in this city broke down every day. You couldn't fix them all. Most days, you couldn't even fix yourself. But the cough came again, wet and desperately shallow. Arthur turned his head, rain slicing sideways against his cheek. Huddled against the brick wall, half hidden by an overflowing trash bin, was a woman. Her clothes were absurd for this zip code. A tailored silk blouse, ruined by the deluge, clung to her shaking frame. Mud splattered up her finely cut trousers. One of her shoes was missing, leaving just a stockinged foot resting directly on the frozen asphalt. She was trembling violently, her arms wrapped tight around her chest, staring blankly at the wet pavement as if waiting to sink into it. Arthur walked over, his wet boot squelching loudly. "Hey!" She flinched, pulling her knees tighter to her chest. Her eyes darted up, sharp, vivid green, but laced with a profound, disorienting panic. Her lips were practically blue, the skin around her mouth stretched tight and ashen. "You're going to freeze out here," Arthur said. His voice was flat, gravelly. He wasn't trying to be gentle. It was simply a fact. "Wallet! Phone! Gone!" she gasped out, her teeth chattering so hard he could hear the distinct clicking over the rain. "Cab driver kicked me out. Card declined. Then someone grabbed my bag." Arthur looked at her, really looked at her. She wasn't an addict. She wasn't local. She was completely, utterly displaced, stripped of whatever armor she usually wore. "Where do you live?" She named a suburb 20 miles out. Wealthy, gated, private security. It might as well have been the moon. Arthur ran a rough hand over his wet face. He looked back at the brightly lit mart. Boxed macaroni, peanut butter, the cheap red toy car Toby had been asking for. He felt the $18 burning a hole against his thigh. He hated himself in that moment. He deeply, profoundly hated his own weak stomach. If he gave her the money for a train ticket or a cab, Toby would eat plain rice and tap water for 3 days. "Get up," Arthur growled. He didn't offer his hand. He just waited for her to stumble to her feet. She leaned heavily against the wet brick, barely able to support her own weight. He pulled the crumpled bills from his pocket. He didn't hand them over gently. He shoved them into her shivering, pale hands. The commuter station is 2 blocks north. There's a late-night train in 20 minutes. $18 covers the zone fare. Go. She stared down at the damp money, her fingers curling around the bills, then looked up at him. Your name? Just go, Arthur said. He turned his back on her and walked into the cold night, his stomach already gnawing at him, his heart heavy with the absolute dread of telling his son. There were no groceries tonight. As Arthur walked away, the wind whipped a stray piece of newspaper against his calf. He didn't look back. Looking back meant acknowledging the transaction, making it real. He shoved his hands deep into his empty pockets, feeling the lint and the cold seeping through the cheap denim. The city smelled of exhaust fumes and wet concrete, a metallic tang that sat heavy in the back of his throat. He imagined Toby's face. Toby never cried when Arthur came home empty-handed. That was the absolute worst part. If the kid threw a tantrum, screamed about wanting macaroni or a toy, Arthur could handle it. He could play the stern parent. But Toby just nodded, his large brown eyes solemn, and said, "It's okay, Dad. I'm not that hungry." It broke Arthur in places he didn't know he still had. He reached his building, a crumbling concrete structure that felt like a localized depression. The hallway smelled of boiled cabbage and old bleach. He knocked on door 1B. Mrs. Higgins opened it, a cloud of cigarette smoke billowing out around her floral robe. "He's asleep on the rug," she croaked. "You owe me for the extra hour, Artie." "I'll catch you on Friday, Martha." Arthur lied smoothly, the exhaustion making his voice hollow. "Promise." He scooped Toby off the threadbare carpet. The boy was light, too light. His small head rested against Arthur's collarbone, a warm, trusting weight. Arthur carried him up 3 flights of stairs to their apartment. The door stuck, requiring a hard shove with his shoulder to unstick the swollen wood. Inside, it was freezing. The radiator hissed, a pathetic sputtering sound that promised nothing. Arthur laid Toby on the sagging mattress they shared, pulling the thin, scratchy quilt up to the boy's chin. He sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, listening to the rain lash against the single, cracked window. He thought about the woman. He thought about her silk blouse and her blue lips. He wondered if she made the train. He wondered if he was the biggest fool in the city. $18. It was everything he had, and he had literally thrown it away on a ghost in an alley. Morning came. Not with sunlight, but with a gradual bruised greying of the sky. Arthur woke up with a stiff neck, his body curled tightly around Toby to conserve body heat. The apartment was silent, except for the rhythmic, wheezing drip of the kitchen faucet. He lay there for a long moment, staring at a water stain on the ceiling that looked vaguely like a crushed fist. The reality of the day settled on his chest like an anvil. No job, no money, half a box of stale cereal in the cupboard. He dragged himself out of bed, his joints popping in the damp chill. He put on the same damp jeans from the night before, shivering as the cold fabric clung to his skin. He poured a glass of tap water, drank it down to quiet the hollow churning in his stomach, and began digging through the pantry. He found a rogue packet of instant oatmeal pushed behind a stack of empty Tupperware. It would be enough for Toby. "Dad?" Arthur turned. Toby was standing in the doorway of the bedroom, clutching a one-eyed stuffed bear. His hair was a bird's nest of bedhead. "Hey, buddy," Arthur said, forcing a smile that felt like cracking plastic. "Oatmeal today. Brown sugar kind." Toby's eyes brightened slightly. "Are we going to the park?" "Maybe later," Arthur deflected. He needed to hit the streets. He needed to find a day labor corner, a landscaping gig, hauling trash, anything, He needed cash by nightfall, or the hunger would stop being a dull ache and start being a sharp blade. He was ladling the gluey oatmeal into a chipped plastic bowl when the sound started. It wasn't a sudden noise. It was a low, synchronized rumble that vibrated through the floorboards before it actually registered in his ears. Arthur paused, the wooden spoon hovering over the bowl. Living next to a main avenue, he was used to traffic noise, the scream of sirens, the heavy clatter of garbage trucks. But this was different. This was a heavy, idling bass, a mechanical growl that felt intentional, coordinated, and entirely out of place in this neighborhood. He set the spoon down. The rumbling grew louder, shaking the loose pane of glass in the kitchen window. Toby walked over, peering around Arthur's leg. "Dad, the floor is vibrating," the boy murmured. "Stay here," Arthur instructed, his voice dropping into a low, defensive register. He walked to the window, rubbing away the condensation with the heel of his hand. He peered down at the street 3 stories below. His breath hitched. The street was narrow, usually lined with rusted-out sedans and overflowing trash bins. Now it was entirely blocked. 5 massive matte-black SUVs were creeping down the cracked asphalt, their heavily tinted windows reflecting the bleak morning sky. They moved in perfect predatory unison. They didn't look like cars. They looked like armor. Arthur felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. In this part of the city, convoys like that meant one of 2 things: federal raids or high-level cartel business. He quickly ran through a mental checklist of his own miserable life. He had no debts to loan sharks. He had no criminal record. He was a nobody. He was invisible. The lead SUV stopped precisely in front of his building's rusted awning. The 4 others boxed it in, shutting down the street completely. A horn blared angrily from a beat-up sedan trapped behind them, but it cut off abruptly as 4 large men stepped out of the rear vehicles. They wore dark suits tailored to conceal bulk. They didn't look around. They just moved into tactical positions facing the street corners. Arthur's pulse thrummed violently in his throat. "Toby," he said, not taking his eyes off the window. "Go get your shoes on, now." "Why?" "Just do it," Arthur snapped. The harshness of his tone made Toby flinch, and the boy scurried back to the bedroom without another word. Arthur watched, paralyzed by a bizarre mix of terror and disbelief. From the lead vehicle, a driver emerged and opened the rear passenger door. A woman stepped out onto the broken sidewalk. Arthur squinted through the dirty glass. She was wearing a sharp, charcoal-grey trench coat over a pristine white turtleneck. Her hair, which had been a plastered, muddy mess the night before, was now a sleek, perfect bob. But even from 3 stories up, Arthur recognized the posture. He recognized the way she tilted her head to look up at the crumbling brick facade of the building. It was the woman from the alley. She wasn't looking at the building generally. She was looking directly at his window. Arthur stumbled back, letting the curtain fall. His mind raced, spinning completely out of control. Who is she? Why is she here? Did I aid a fugitive? Did the $18 tie me to something worse? Paranoia, fueled by lack of sleep and an empty stomach, took the wheel. He looked around the tiny, depressing apartment. There was no fire escape. There was no back door. Heavy, synchronized footsteps echoed in the stairwell outside. They were coming up, not walking casually, but ascending with a rapid, heavy purpose that shook the thin drywall. "Dad?" Toby was back, his small sneakers on the wrong feet, looking terrified by the sheer panic radiating from his father. "Get behind the counter," Arthur whispered fiercely, grabbing Toby by the shoulders and pushing him behind the cheap laminate kitchen island. The footsteps stopped on their floor. Right outside door 3C. Arthur looked for a weapon. His eyes darted to the stovetop. He grabbed a heavy cast-iron pan, gripping the handle so tight his knuckles turned white. He stood in the center of the tiny living room, his chest heaving, listening to the absolute silence on the other side of the cheap wooden door. A knock, not a police pound, a sharp, polite, authoritative rap of knuckles. Arthur didn't move. He barely breathed. "Mr. Pendleton," a voice called out through the thin wood. It was female, crisp, clear, and commanding. It belonged in a boardroom, not a run-down tenement hall. "Arthur Pendleton, please open the door. I owe you a debt." Arthur stared at the door, the pan heavy in his sweating hand. The acrid smell of burning oatmeal suddenly hit his nose. He had left the burner on. The sheer, overwhelming absurdity of it all crashed over him. 5 tactical vehicles, men in suits, and a woman who looked like she owned half the city, standing outside his rotting door, talking about a debt over $18. He slowly lowered the pan, his hands trembling with a profound, terrifying uncertainty. Smoke started to sting Arthur's eyes. The forgotten oatmeal was scorching against the bottom of the cheap aluminum pot, filling the cramped kitchen with the acrid stench of burnt sugar and charred grain. It was the smell of his last viable meal turning to ash. He didn't turn around to turn off the burner. He kept his hand firmly on the brass doorknob. The metal was freezing. It rattled loosely in its socket, a testament to the dozens of times the door had been kicked in before he ever moved in. He turned the deadbolt. The clack sounded like a gunshot in the quiet apartment. Arthur pulled the door open exactly 2 inches. He kept his foot wedged firmly against the baseboard, his body angled to block any view of the living room where Toby was hiding behind the laminate counter. Through the crack, he saw her. Up close, the contrast between the woman from the alley and the woman standing in his doorway was violently jarring. She wore a tailored wool trench coat that probably cost more than Arthur had earned in the last 3 years. Her skin, which had been grey and slack the night before, was pale but taut, framed by sharp cheekbones and impeccably styled dark hair. She didn't look scared anymore. She looked like someone who dictated reality for a living, but it was the smell that hit him first. A wave of sandalwood and sharp, synthetic citrus cut straight through the hallway's permanent funk of boiled cabbage and old mop water. It was the scent of wealth. It smelled intrusive. Behind her, 2 massive men in dark suits stood like stone pillars, their eyes scanning the peeling paint of the stairwell with clinical detachment. "Mr. Pendleton," the woman said. Her voice was steady, modulated perfectly to convey authority without raising the volume. She didn't smile. A smile would have been fake, and they both knew it. "I apologize for the intrusion, and the theatrics downstairs. My security detail tends to overcompensate after a breach." Arthur just stared at her through the 2-inch gap. His jaw tightened. He could hear the hiss of the burning oatmeal behind him. "How do you know my name?" "Your landlord, Mrs. Higgins, I believe." "She was quite accommodating when my associates knocked on her door a few minutes ago," she said, her green eyes locking onto his. "May I come in?" "No," Arthur said flatly. The blunt refusal hung in the air. One of the security men shifted his weight, his heavy leather shoe creaking loudly against the floorboards. The woman held up a single, manicured hand, stopping the guard's movement instantly. "I understand," she said. She didn't look offended. She looked calculating. "My name is Vivian Caldwell. I run Caldwell Logistics. Last night, my personal driver was compromised. I was left in that alley without my phone, my coat, or my cards. I was going into hypothermic shock. My core temperature at the hospital was 94 degrees. She paused, letting the clinical reality of the numbers settle between them. The ER doctor informed me that if I had stayed on the concrete for another hour, my organs would have begun failing. Vivian continued, her voice dropping a fraction of an octave. I made the commuter train with 3 minutes to spare. Because of you. Because of your $18. Good for you, Arthur muttered. He pushed his shoulder against the door, intending to close it. You're alive. Debt paid. Now get these guys out of my hallway before the cops show up. Arthur, wait, Vivian said, stepping forward. The tip of her expensive leather boot pressed against the bottom edge of the door, just enough to prevent him from shutting it. It was a bold move. In this neighborhood, putting your foot in someone's door was an invitation to lose it. Arthur's eyes dropped to her boot, then snapped back to her face. His pulse hammered in his ears, a frantic animal rhythm. He was tired. He was so incredibly tired, and the adrenaline was making him nauseous. Look, lady, Arthur growled, his voice trembling slightly with suppressed rage. You don't understand how things work here. You rolling up in armored tanks doesn't make me look like a hero. It makes me look like a rat, or a dealer, or a problem. The people on this block don't like problems. You are putting a target on my back just by standing here. I don't want your money. I don't want a reward. I want you to leave. Vivian looked at him. Really looked at him, just as he had done to her in the alley. She took in the dark circles under his eyes, the frayed collar of his thermal shirt, the defensive, hunched posture of a man who spent his life waiting for the next blow. I am not here to give you a reward, Mr. Pendleton, Vivian said quietly. The corporate Polish cracked just a fraction, revealing a sliver of the desperate woman from the rain. I am here because I owe you a debt of equivalence. You gave me everything you had. I know what that was. I saw your hesitation. I saw you calculate the cost. You gave me your last dollar. It was $18, Arthur shot back, his pride flaring hot and bitter in his chest. Don't make it a tragedy. Dad? The small, frightened voice came from behind Arthur. Arthur's blood ran cold. He whipped his head around. Toby had peeked out from behind the kitchen island, coughing softly as the smoke from the stove finally reached his lungs. His oversized t-shirt swallowed his thin frame, and his eyes were wide with fear, staring at the intimidating strangers in the doorway. Vivian's gaze shifted past Arthur, landing on the boy. The heavy silence in the hallway shifted. The tension changed shape. It stopped being a standoff between two adults and became something entirely different. Arthur shoved the door hard, trying to dislodge her foot. I said, "Get out!" Vivian didn't budge. She didn't look at Arthur. She kept her eyes on Toby, her expression unreadable. The smell of burning oatmeal was overwhelming now, a bitter reminder of Arthur's failure to provide the absolute bare minimum. Your breakfast is burning, Arthur, Vivian said, her voice completely devoid of judgment, which somehow made it worse. And your son is hungry. Arthur abandoned the door. He turned his back on Vivian, striding the 4 steps to the stovetop and violently twisting the dial to shut off the gas. He grabbed the hot handle of the pot bare-handed, hissed at the searing pain, and dumped the blackened, smoking mass into the rusted sink. Steam billowed up, smelling of scorched failure. He gripped the edge of the sink, his knuckles white, fighting the sudden, humiliating sting of tears in the corners of his eyes. He wasn't crying out of sadness. He was vibrating with a deep, toxic mixture of shame and fury. This woman, this billionaire from a different planet, had invaded his microscopic territory and witnessed his inability to feed his own child. He heard the creak of the door opening wider. Heavy footsteps crossed the threshold. I told you not to come in, Arthur ground out, keeping his back to them. I told the guards to wait in the hall, Vivian replied calmly. Her footsteps, distinct sharp clicks on the warped linoleum, stopped a few feet behind him. Toby ran across the small room and wrapped his arms tightly around Arthur's leg, burying his face in his father's thigh. Arthur dropped a protective hand onto the boy's messy hair, his thumb stroking the back of Toby's neck. "Toby, it's okay," Arthur whispered, though his own voice shook. "Go back to the bedroom. Close the door." "I want to stay with you," Toby muffled into the denim. Vivian stood in the center of the living room. She didn't pace. She didn't touch anything. She simply observed. Her eyes tracked the water damage on the ceiling, the drafty windows stuffed with old newspaper, the single threadbare blanket folded neatly on the sagging mattress in the corner. "I run a supply chain logistics company," Vivian said abruptly, breaking the heavy silence. "We move freight across 3 continents. I manage a fleet of 12,000 vehicles and 40,000 employees. I am accustomed to calculating value, assets, liabilities, ROI. Arthur turned around slowly. He wiped his soot-stained hand on his jeans. "Is this supposed to impress me, Ms. Caldwell? Because right now, you're just trespassing." Vivian ignored the barb. "Last night, my CFO attempted to force a hostile buyout. He paid my private security to abandon me in a zone where I would likely become a statistic. It was a calculated risk on his part. He assumed I wouldn't survive the night." She looked directly into Arthur's eyes. He miscalculated. Arthur frowned. The sheer scale of her world was incomprehensible, but the betrayal was universal. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you need to understand that the $18 you gave me wasn't charity. It was capital," Vivian stated, her tone shifting into something purely transactional. "It was the seed investment that allowed me to return to my estate, contact federal authorities, and freeze my company's assets before the markets opened this morning. You didn't just save my life, Arthur. You saved my empire." Arthur let out a short, hollow bark of laughter. It scraped his throat. "Great. Send me a plaque." Vivian reached into the pocket of her coat. Arthur tensed, his hand instinctively gripping Toby tighter. She pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope and placed it on the edge of the cheap kitchen island. "There is a cashier's check in there for $100,000, Vivian said. Arthur stared at the envelope. It looked alien sitting on the chipped faux granite laminate. $100,000. The number didn't even compute. It wasn't money. It was a concept. It was a new apartment. It was groceries for years. It was winter coats for Toby that actually fit. But beneath the desperate, starving part of Arthur's brain, a darker, colder instinct woke up. "No," Arthur said. The word fell out of his mouth before he even fully processed it. Vivian's perfectly arched eyebrows twitched in genuine surprise. "Excuse me." "I said no." Arthur stepped forward, placing himself squarely between Toby and the envelope. "Nobody gives away $100,000 with no strings attached. Not in your world, and definitely not in mine. If I cash that, I'm on a ledger. I'm tied to a hostile takeover, a corrupt CFO, and God knows what else. The IRS audits me. The local gangs find out I have cash. I become a target." He picked up the envelope by the very corner, as if it were radioactive, and shoved it back toward her. "Take it back." Vivian didn't reach for it. She looked at the envelope, then back at Arthur. A strange expression crossed her face, a flicker of deep, unvarnished respect. "You are cynical, Mr. Pendleton," she observed quietly. "I'm awake," Arthur shot back. "And I'm surviving, barely. But I'm doing it my way. I don't need your blood money. I don't want to be part of your corporate war." Vivian slowly nodded. She picked up the envelope and slid it back into her coat. "Fair enough. You reject the cash. You see the hidden costs. You're smarter than 90% of the board members I fired this morning." She took a step towards the door, her heels clicking sharply. Arthur felt a sudden, crushing wave of relief mixed with a sickening sense of loss. He had just thrown away a fortune to keep his pride and his safety. The kitchen still smelled like burnt oatmeal. However, Vivian paused, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She turned back to look at him, her green eyes sharp and unyielding. The debt remains, and I do not leave debts unpaid. It is a fundamental flaw in my character. Arthur crossed his arms, his jaw set. So what now? If you won't take my money, Vivian said, glancing down at Toby, who was watching her with wide, quiet eyes, then you will take my employment. Arthur blinked. What? You are out of work. You have a child to feed. I have a company that is currently hemorrhaging untrustworthy personnel, Vivian stated rapidly, her boardroom persona locking fully into place. I need people who understand the value of $1. I need people who don't flinch. I need a driver I can trust to not leave me in an alley. I don't have a chauffeur's license, Arthur said, his mind spinning. I own the licensing division, Vivian countered smoothly. Pack a bag, Arthur, for you and the boy. You're leaving this apartment, today. Arthur shook his head, overwhelmed. I can't just leave. I have a lease. You have nothing, Vivian interrupted, her voice dropping the polite veneer, hitting him with the cold, hard truth. You have no food. You have a broken boot. You have a son sleeping in a coat because your radiator is dead. Arthur flinched. The words felt like physical blows because they were agonizingly accurate. Pride will keep you warm for exactly one more night, Arthur, Vivian said softly. After that, it just starves you. The SUVs are waiting. We leave in 5 minutes. She turned and walked out the door, leaving it open behind her. Arthur stood frozen in the quiet apartment. The low rumble of the idling engines down on the street suddenly sounded less like a threat and more like a countdown. He looked down at Toby. Toby looked back, clutching his one-eyed bear, waiting for his father to tell him how the world worked. Dust motes danced in the pale grey light filtering through the cracked kitchen window. Arthur stood rooted to the peeling linoleum. The engine noise from the street below vibrated through his worn boot soles, a low, mechanical hum that felt like a ticking clock. He looked at the chipped sink containing the charred, smoking remains of their breakfast. He looked at the radiator that hadn't produced heat since late October. He was a man who prided himself on standing on his own 2 feet, even if those feet were freezing and his pockets were entirely empty. Taking a handout felt like swallowing broken glass. But keeping his son in a freezing room because of a bruised, battered ego, that wasn't pride. That was poison. Dad? Toby asked, his small voice barely breaking the heavy silence. Are we going? Arthur swallowed hard, the words scraping against his dry throat. Yeah, buddy, we're going. He moved fast. There were no suitcases in the apartment. Arthur pulled 2 heavy-duty black trash bags from under the sink and snapped them open. The thick plastic rustled aggressively, loud and harsh. He walked into the cramped bedroom and started grabbing clothes. Toby's jeans, his worn-out sweaters, the 3 pairs of socks that didn't have holes in the heels. He tossed them into the first bag. He moved to his own meagre pile. 2 flannel shirts, a pair of work pants permanently stained with white joint compound, his cracked leather belt. He grabbed a faded plastic folder containing Toby's birth certificate, his own expired union card, and a handful of medical records, sealing them in a zip-top sandwich box before tossing it in. He looked around the bedroom. There was nothing else worth taking. 34 years of life, reduced to 30 pounds of fabric in a garbage bag. He walked back into the living room. Toby was already wearing his coat, clutching his one-eyed bear in one hand and his favourite cheap red plastic car in the other. Grab your backpack, Toby, Arthur instructed, his voice tight. Put the bear in there. Arthur hoisted the two trash bags over his shoulder. They clacked together awkwardly. He looked back at the apartment one last time. It was a miserable, rotting box. It smelled of damp drywall and failure. Yet, stepping out of it felt like stepping off a cliff. Here, he knew the rules. Here, he knew how to suffer. Out there, in Vivian Caldwell's world, he was entirely blind. He pulled the front door shut. The lock clicked, sealing the empty apartment. They walked down the 3 flights of stairs. The familiar stench of boiled cabbage and stale cigarette smoke clung to the stairwell, but Arthur barely registered it. His heart was hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm against his ribs. When they reached the ground floor, Mrs. Higgins's door was cracked open. A single, rheumy eye peered out through the chain lock, watching them leave. Arthur didn't wave. He just kept his head down, pushing the heavy main door open into the freezing morning air. The street was exactly as Vivian had left it. The 5 matte black SUVs idled in perfect formation. The neighbors were watching from their windows, pale faces pressed against dirty glass, observing the spectacle. Arthur felt a hot flush of humiliation burn the back of his neck. He was carrying his life in trash bags, walking toward a billionaire's motorcade while the whole block watched. A man in a tailored dark suit stepped away from the lead vehicle and opened the rear door. He didn't look at the garbage bags. He didn't look at Arthur's boots. His face was a blank, professional mask. "Mr. Pendleton," the man said smoothly, gesturing inside. Arthur pushed Toby into the cavernous rear cabin first, then threw the trash bags onto the floorboards before climbing in himself. The heavy door closed behind him with a solid, airtight thud. The contrast was instantaneous and violently jarring. The interior of the SUV didn't smell like the city. It smelled of rich, treated leather and subtle, expensive cologne. The air blowing from the invisible vents was blissfully warm, thawing the numbness in Arthur's fingers within seconds. Vivian sat across from them in a rear-facing captain's chair. She was already staring at a sleek, matte black tablet, her fingers moving rapidly across the glass. She didn't look up as they settled into the seats. "Belt him in," Vivian ordered quietly, her eyes still locked on her screen. "We have a lot of ground to cover." Arthur reached over, pulling the heavy nylon strap across Toby's chest and clicking it into place. The boy sunk into the plush leather, his eyes wide as he took in the glowing ambient lights and the soft, carpeted floor mats. The vehicle lurched forward smoothly, a seamless acceleration that pushed Arthur back into his seat. He watched through the heavily tinted glass as his crumbling apartment building slid out of view. He watched the rusted awnings, the graffiti-covered brick, and the overflowing dumpsters disappear behind them. He had $18 to his name yesterday. Today he was riding in an armored fortress, owned by a woman who could buy and sell his entire neighborhood before her morning coffee. Arthur rested his rough hand on Toby's knee. He looked across the cabin at Vivian. Her face was illuminated by the cold blue light of her tablet. She looked ruthless. She looked entirely in control. Arthur realized with a sudden, sinking clarity that he hadn't just accepted a job. He had surrendered his autonomy. He was officially property of Caldwell Logistics. Armored glass doesn't just block bullets. It completely suffocates the outside world. The interior of the SUV was a sensory vacuum compared to the chaotic, grinding hum of the city Arthur was used to. No sirens pierced the cabin, no yelling from the sidewalks, just the faint, synthetic rush of climate control and the muted, rhythmic thrum of the heavy tires eating up the asphalt. Arthur sat stiffly on the buttery black leather. His muscles were locked, coiled tight with an exhaustion that went straight to his bone marrow. He felt filthy. The grime of his life seemed magnified in this pristine environment. He caught a glimpse of his reflection in the polished wood grain trim of the door panel. Hollow cheeks, a dark shadow of stubble, eyes that looked like they hadn't rested in a decade. Beside him, the sheer warmth of the cabin had already done its work. Toby's head lolled to the side, resting against the soft window pillar. His breathing deepened, shifting into the heavy, untroubled rhythm of deep sleep. Arthur watched his son's chest rise and fall, feeling a sharp ache in his throat. Toby hadn't slept that peacefully in months. "He's exhausted," Vivian remarked. She hadn't looked up from her tablet, but her voice cut cleanly through the quiet cabin. "It's been a rough week," Arthur replied, his tone guarded. "It's been a rough year from what my background check indicates," Vivian countered, tapping a final command on her screen before locking the device and setting it aside. She finally looked at him. Her green eyes were calculating, stripping away his defensive layers. "Union construction gig went under 10 months ago. 2 evictions narrowly avoided. Handyman cash jobs since then. You have 0 debt, which is mathematically impressive given your income bracket, but you have absolutely no safety net." Arthur's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. The violation of privacy stung, a hot flare of anger rising in his chest. "You ran a background check in the last 20 minutes. I ran it the moment I got back to my secure terminal last night. I needed to know exactly who was in possession of my last known location," Vivian said, entirely unapologetic. "I don't leave loose ends, Arthur. By the time the sun came up, I knew your work history, your credit score, and the fact that you paid your wife's hospital bills down to 0 before she passed." Arthur flinched. The mention of Sarah hit him like a physical blow to the ribs. He looked away, staring out the tinted window. The grey concrete slums had given way to rolling forested hills and wide, perfectly paved highways. "Don't talk about my wife," Arthur growled, his voice dropping an octave, dangerous and frayed. "I'm not talking about her. I'm talking about you," Vivian said smoothly. "I'm talking about a man who chooses to be broke rather than be in debt. That tells me a lot about your character. It tells me you are fiercely independent, stubborn to a fault, and extremely protective. Those are exactly the traits I require for the position I am offering." "You said you needed a driver," Arthur said, turning back to face her. "I have drivers. I have a fleet of them," Vivian corrected. She leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on her knees. The sandalwood scent of her perfume mixed with the leather of the car. "I need a shadow. I need someone who operates outside the standard corporate ecosystem. My CFO bought my entire security detail. They smiled at me, opened my doors, and then dumped me in an alley to die. I cannot hire from within my own ranks anymore. I need an outsider, someone whose loyalty is tied directly to me. And you think you can buy my loyalty with a paycheck and a warm car?" Arthur challenged, his cynicism flaring. "No," Vivian said softly. She glanced at the sleeping boy beside him. "I think I can buy it by guaranteeing that child never sleeps in a freezing room again. I'm not asking for your soul, Arthur. I'm asking for your vigilance. You watch my back. I secure his future. It is a mutually beneficial transaction." The vehicle began to slow. Outside the window, massive wrought iron gates came into view, flanked by high stone walls topped with security cameras. The gates swung open smoothly, revealing a sprawling estate that looked less like a home and more like a high-tech fortress cloaked in manicured landscaping. The convoy navigated a long, sweeping gravel driveway, finally coming to a halt in front of a sprawling, modern mansion built of glass, dark steel, and grey stone. "We are here," Vivian announced, picking up her tablet. The corporate armor snapped firmly back into place. "My head of household, Hayes, will show you to your quarters. Rest, eat. Someone will bring you proper clothing. We begin your onboarding at 1800 hours. Before Arthur could respond, the driver opened the door, letting in a rush of crisp, cold, pine-scented air. Arthur unbuckled Toby, gathering the heavy, sleeping boy into his arms. He stepped out of the SUV onto the crushed gravel. The massive stone house loomed over him, silent and imposing. He grabbed his 2 trash bags of belongings, feeling entirely ridiculous standing in front of a billionaire's mansion holding actual garbage. A tall, austere man in a grey suit, Hayes presumably, was already waiting on the stone steps. He didn't blink at the trash bags. He merely gave a slight nod. "Mr. Pendleton, please follow me." Arthur followed the man into the house. He walked across heated slate floors, past modern art that probably cost more than his entire life's earnings. He was a rat in a maze of wealth. He had secured his son's survival, but as the heavy oak door of their new guest suite clicked shut behind him, Arthur couldn't shake the terrifying realization that he had absolutely no idea what it was going to cost him. Silence in the guest suite was absolute, heavy, and deeply unnatural. Arthur stood in the center of the sprawling room, the 2 black trash bags sitting incongruously on a plush, cream-colored rug that probably cost more than a year of his rent. The air smelled faintly of lavender and ozone. There were no sirens bleeding through the walls, no muffled shouting from the hallway, no rattling pipes. It was a sensory void, and it made Arthur's skin crawl. He walked over to the massive bed, setting Toby down on top of the heavy down duvet. The boy barely stirred, exhausted by the sheer emotional whiplash of the morning. Arthur pulled his worn boots off, leaving them on the slate tile near the door so he wouldn't track city grease onto the pristine carpet. A knock sounded at the door, polite but firm. Arthur crossed the room in his stockinged feet and pulled it open. Hayes stood there, holding a covered silver tray in one hand and a thick canvas garment bag in the other. "For the boy when he wakes," Hayes said, extending the tray. "And for you, sir. Ms. Caldwell requires proper attire for the evening briefing." Arthur took the tray and the bag. "I'm not calling her sir or saluting, if that's what you're expecting." Hayes's expression didn't change, but a fraction of a muscle twitched near his jaw. "Ms. Caldwell prefers directness, Mr. Pendleton. Saluting would only annoy her." He turned on his heel and walked down the expansive, dimly lit corridor. Arthur brought the items inside. He set the tray on a glass coffee table and lifted the silver dome. The smell hit him instantly, a rich, buttery wave of roasted chicken, herb potatoes, and fresh vegetables. His stomach cramped violently, a sharp, physical demand that made his hands shake. He forced himself to turn away. Let Toby eat first. That was the rule. He carried the canvas bag into the attached bathroom. The space was absurd. A massive glass shower enclosure, a soaking tub carved from dark stone, heated floors radiating a subtle, steady warmth through his socks. Arthur stripped off his damp jeans and the thermal shirt that smelled intensely of burnt oatmeal and cold sweat. He turned on the shower, flinching when the water hit the tiles. It was immediately, fiercely hot. Stepping under the spray, Arthur closed his eyes. The water pressure was heavy, drumming against his tense shoulders. He grabbed a bar of cedar-scented soap and began to scrub. He scrubbed until his skin turned raw and pink, trying to wash away the grime of the city, the smell of the alleyway, the lingering, toxic shame of not being able to provide for his son. The hot water felt like an absolute luxury, but it also felt like a bribe. Every minute he stood under it, he was incurring a debt. When he stepped out, the mirror above the double vanity was completely fogged over. He wiped a circle clear with the edge of a thick Egyptian cotton towel. He stared at his own face. The dark circles under his eyes were prominent, standing out against his pale, scrubbed skin. He didn't look like a corporate operative. He looked like a tired construction worker who had stumbled into the wrong zip code. He unzipped the canvas bag. Inside hung a dark charcoal suit, a crisp white shirt, and a pair of matte black leather shoes. Arthur pulled the shirt on. The cotton was stiff, cold, and flawless. The trousers fit perfectly, snapping shut at the waist with a tailored precision that felt intrusive. He tied the shoes, the stiff leather fighting against his calloused heels. He felt wrapped in armor, but it was someone else's armor. It was a leash disguised as a uniform. By the time he walked back into the bedroom, Toby was sitting up, rubbing his eyes. "Dad," Toby mumbled, looking around the massive room in confusion. His gaze landed on Arthur in the suit. "You look weird." "Feel weird, buddy," Arthur admitted, his voice rough. He pointed to the tray. "There's food, real food. Eat as much as you want." He watched Toby tear into the chicken with a desperate, uncoordinated hunger that made Arthur's chest ache. He waited until the boy was full before eating the remnants himself. The food tasted rich, almost too rich for a stomach used to processed starches, but he forced it down. Calories were capital, and he needed his strength. At exactly 17:55, Arthur looked at the analog clock on the nightstand. "Stay here, Toby. Don't leave the room. I mean it. Keep the door locked." Toby nodded, fully engrossed in a cartoon playing silently on a flat screen the size of a dining table. Arthur stepped out into the quiet hallway. Hayes was already waiting at the end of the corridor. They walked in silence through the sprawling house, descending a wide, floating staircase into what felt like a subterranean level. The ambient temperature dropped noticeably. The smell of lavender faded, replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of chilled air and running electronics. Hayes pushed open a set of heavy, frosted glass doors. The room beyond wasn't a living space. It was a war room. Banks of monitors covered the far wall, glowing with endless streams of data, stock tickers, and security feeds. The space hummed with a low, vibrating frequency from rows of server racks housed behind a glass partition. Vivian stood at the center of the room, leaning over a massive digital map projected onto a drafting table. She was still wearing the white turtleneck, but her hair was pulled back into a severe, tight knot. She looked incredibly exhausted, the pale fluorescent light emphasizing the sharp angles of her face and the dark bruising of fatigue under her green eyes. She didn't look up when Arthur entered. "Right on time, Mr. Pendleton. Come look at this." Arthur approached the table. He stood next to her, acutely aware of the stiff collar of his new shirt pressing against his throat. He looked down at the map. It was a topographical overlay of the city, peppered with glowing red and blue markers. "What am I looking at?" Arthur asked, his voice deliberately flat. "You're looking at a hostile takeover executed at the street level," Vivian said, finally turning to look at him. She dragged her eyes up and down the charcoal suit, giving a curt, approving nod. "You clean up well, Arthur. Now let's see if you can get dirty again." Cold air blasted from the ceiling vents, stirring the loose papers scattered across the edge of the drafting table. Arthur stared at the glowing map, his eyes instinctively tracing the grid lines of the city. He recognized the heavy cluster of red markers in the southern sector. It was his side of town, the industrial district, the rotting piers, the neglected tenements. "My CFO, Colin Vance, didn't just freeze my accounts and lock me out of the mainframe," Vivian stated, her voice tight and entirely devoid of emotion. She tapped a cluster of blue dots situated in the wealthy financial district. "He utilized corporate funds to hire independent contractors to handle me last night. Not our internal security. He knew they'd be traced too easily. He hired street talent." Arthur crossed his arms. the expensive wool of his suit jacket stretching tightly across his broad shoulders. "So you were mugged by professionals?" "I was supposed to be erased by professionals," Vivian corrected him bluntly. "They were paid to make it look like a tragic, random act of urban violence. An executive in the wrong place at the wrong time. It happens every week. The police wouldn't look twice, especially with Colin greasing the right precincts." She pointed a manicured finger at the cluster of red dots on the south side. "These markers represent Colin's blind spots, the network of burners, stash houses, and intermediaries he used to hire the crew. I can track digital footprints anywhere in the world, Arthur. I can see a wire transfer bounce from Zurich to the Cayman Islands in 3 seconds. But I cannot track a duffel bag of untraceable cash handed off in a rusted-out warehouse in the meatpacking district." Arthur let out a slow, harsh breath. He understood exactly what she was saying. He knew that world. It was a world entirely disconnected from fiber optic cables and algorithms. It ran on physical handoffs, unspoken threats, and analog violence. "You want me to go back out there?" Arthur said, his jaw tightening. "It wasn't a question. I need physical leverage," Vivian said, meeting his gaze. The vulnerability she had shown in his kitchen was completely gone, replaced by a ruthless, calculated drive. "Colin is currently pushing a narrative to the board that I suffered a mental breakdown and abandoned my post. He is initiating a vote of no confidence at 8 a.m. tomorrow. I have 14 hours to prove he orchestrated an assassination attempt." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a heavy brass key, dropping it onto the glass surface of the table. It landed with a sharp, heavy clack. "This belongs to a locker at the central bus terminal downtown," Vivian explained. "The crew that dumped me in the alley took my briefcase. It contained a physical ledger, an analog backup of Colin's offshore embezzlement. He didn't know the ledger was in there. He just wanted the briefcase to make it look like a robbery. The crew hasn't handed it over to him yet. They stashed it, waiting for their final payment." Arthur stared at the brass key. "How do you know it's in a locker?" "Because the man who took it from me was wearing a jacket from a specific local trucking union." "Local 402, Vivian said, her eyes narrowing. "They run the freight lines out of the central terminal. It's their territory. They use those lockers for drops." Arthur's stomach dropped. He recognized the number. Local 402 is run by the Kincaid brothers. They aren't just contractors. They're a cartel. If Colin hired them, he's playing with fire he can't put out. Which is why you're going to walk into that terminal and get my briefcase before Colin's men do," Vivian said, her tone leaving zero room for negotiation. Arthur let out a dry, humorless laugh. "You want me to walk into Kincaid territory in a $3,000 suit and just open a locker? I'll be bleeding out on the linoleum before I get the key in the slot. They have eyes on every inch of that terminal." "You won't be wearing the suit," Vivian countered, stepping closer. The faint scent of sandalwood cut through the cold air. "You'll be wearing whatever you wore yesterday. You know how these men operate. You know how to walk past them without being seen, because you've been doing it your entire life. You are invisible to them, Arthur. You are just another desperate guy in a broken coat." The sheer accuracy of her assessment stung. Arthur hated that she was right. For 34 years, his greatest defense mechanism had been his lack of consequence. Nobody robbed the guy with holes in his boots. Nobody paid attention to the tired father carrying groceries. "And what if I say no?" Arthur asked, his voice dropping low. "What if I take Toby and walk out those front gates right now?" Vivian didn't flinch. She just looked at him with an absolute, terrifying calm. "You won't, because out there, you are $18 away from freezing to death. In here, you have a chance to secure your son's future permanently. If you retrieve that ledger, I will set up an irrevocable trust for Toby. $500,000, vested when he turns 18. Regardless of what happens to me or my company, he will never have to choose between a meal and a heating bill. Arthur closed his eyes. The exhaustion in his bones felt suddenly heavier, anchoring him to the floor. $500,000. It was a number that didn't just change a life, it changed a bloodline. It was the absolute end of the generational rot he had been drowning in. He opened his eyes and looked down at the brass key resting on the cold glass. The edges were worn, scratched from use. He thought of Toby, sleeping soundly in a warm bed upstairs, his stomach full for the first time in a week. Arthur reached out and snatched the key off the table, the cold metal digging sharply into his calloused palm. "I need a burner phone," Arthur said, his voice entirely devoid of warmth, fully accepting the transaction. "And a crowbar, because Kincaid's guys don't just watch the lockers. They jam the locks to see who comes back to complain." A slow, razor-thin smile touched the corners of Vivian's mouth. "Hayes will have your equipment ready in 5 minutes. Sleet replaced the morning's rain, driving sideways across the concrete plaza and freezing against the glass doors of the central bus terminal. Arthur pushed through the heavy doors, instantly hit by a wall of stagnant, heated air. The terminal smelled exactly as it always had, a nauseating blend of diesel exhaust, stale pretzels, and industrial ammonia used to mask the scent of urine. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly, flickering yellow pallor over the scattered drifters and exhausted travelers slumped in molded plastic chairs. He was back in his own clothes. The damp thermal shirt clung to his ribs, and the broken sole of his right boot squelched with every step on the dirty linoleum. He felt the familiar, heavy drape of his worn denim jacket, the cold iron of the small crowbar pressed tight against his inner forearm. He kept his head down, slouching his shoulders. He didn't look around. He let his eyes glaze over, adopting the vacant, hollow stare of a man who had nowhere to be and no hope of getting there. It was a posture he had perfected over years of being broke. It was the armor of the invisible. The lockers were in the east wing, tucked behind a shuttered newsstand. It was a dead zone, deliberately poorly lit. Row upon row of battered orange metal doors stretched down a narrow corridor. Arthur shuffled toward the corridor. He spotted the watcher immediately. Leaning against a trash can near the entrance of the locker aisle was a heavy-set man in a faded brown Carhartt jacket. He was chewing a plastic coffee stirrer, his eyes scanning the sparse crowd with predatory boredom. He had the thick, ruined knuckles and thick neck of a local enforcer. A local 402 Kincaid guy. Arthur's heart slammed against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird in his chest. His palms started to sweat, slipping slightly against the concealed iron bar in his sleeve. He forced himself not to break stride. He didn't hesitate or look away nervously. He just shuffled forward, a broken man heading toward a corner to sleep. He passed the watcher. The man didn't even blink. To him, Arthur was just part of the urban decay. Arthur counted the numbers, stenciled in fading black paint on the orange doors. 410, 411, 412. He stopped, his back to the watcher at the end of the hall. He pulled the brass key from his pocket and slid it into the slot. It went in half an inch and stopped dead. Metal ground against dried superglue. Vivian had been right. They jammed the cylinder, waiting for the owner to panic and reveal themselves. Arthur didn't panic. He just felt cold. Absolute resolve. He thought of Toby sleeping under a thick down comforter. He thought of the $500,000 trust. He slid the crowbar out of his sleeve. He jammed the wedged tip into the narrow gap between the metal door and the frame, right above the locking mechanism. He took a short, silent breath and leaned his entire body weight into the iron bar. Crack! The sound was brutally loud in the quiet corridor. The cheap, rusted metal of the locker frame warped, the locking pins snapping with a harsh metallic ping. The orange door swung open. Inside sat a battered oxblood leather briefcase. "Hey!" a rough, gravelly voice barked from the end of the hall. "Step away from the box, dead meat." Arthur didn't turn around to explain. He didn't try to talk his way out. He reached in, grabbed the thick leather handle of the briefcase, and pulled it free. It was heavy, packed with physical paper. He spun around just as the watcher charged down the narrow aisle, pulling a heavy steel flashlight from his coat pocket. The man swung the flashlight at Arthur's head. It wasn't a choreographed movie fight. It was messy, panicked, and entirely desperate. Arthur ducked, the heavy steel whistling past his ear, tearing the cold air. Driven by pure adrenaline, Arthur drove his shoulder forward, burying it directly into the larger man's chest. They crashed into the opposite row of lockers with a deafening, echoing boom. The watcher grunted, losing his grip on the flashlight, which clattered loudly to the linoleum. He grabbed a handful of Arthur's jacket, yanking him close, his hot, coffee-scented breath hitting Arthur's face. A heavy fist clipped Arthur's cheekbone, exploding into a flash of white-hot pain that blurred his vision. Arthur didn't try to punch back. He just needed to survive. He brought the crowbar up in a short, blind arc, driving the blunt iron handle hard into the man's kneecap. A sickening crunch echoed through the hall. The watcher screamed, his grip loosening as his leg buckled beneath him. Arthur tore himself free. He didn't look back. He sprinted down the aisle, his lungs burning, his broken boot slipping on the slick floor. He burst out of the locker corridor and sprinted across the main terminal, dodging a startled janitor and a rolling suitcase. He hit the heavy glass doors, bursting out into the freezing sleet. Half a block down, idling in the shadows of an overpass, was a sleek black sedan. Hayes was behind the wheel. Arthur yanked the back door open, threw the briefcase onto the floorboards, and dove in, slamming the door shut. "Drive," Arthur gasped, spitting a line of blood from his split lip onto his sleeve. Hayes didn't ask questions. The sedan merged seamlessly into the midnight traffic, disappearing into the storm. An hour later, Arthur stood back in the subterranean war room. His jaw throbbed with a dull, rhythmic agony, and his knuckles were scraped raw. He placed the oxblood briefcase on the glass drafting table. Vivian unlatched it. She flipped through the dense stacks of ledger paper, her green eyes scanning the columns of analog ink. A deep, chilling satisfaction settled over her face. "It's all here," she said quietly. She didn't thank him. Instead, she picked up her tablet, her fingers flying across the screen. A moment later, she turned the tablet to face him. It was a banking confirmation screen. An irrevocable trust, established in the name of Tobias Pendleton. Balance, $500,000. "The funds are locked, Arthur, untouchable by anyone but him, upon his 18th birthday," Vivian stated, meeting his bruised gaze. "The debt is paid." Arthur stared at the glowing numbers. The pain in his jaw faded. The coldness of the sleet vanished. He had done it. He had broken the cycle. "Clean yourself up," Vivian commanded, turning back to the map. "Colin will be in custody by dawn, but the board will panic. We have a lot of work to do." Arthur left the war room and rode the silent elevator back to his suite. He pushed the heavy oak door open and walked to the bed. Toby was still sound asleep, his chest rising and falling in a steady, peaceful rhythm, his one-eyed bear tucked securely under his arm. Arthur sat on the edge of the mattress. He was bruised. He was exhausted. He was entirely bound to a billionaire's corporate war. But as he looked at his son, safe, warm, and guaranteed a future, Arthur realized he didn't care. He had sold his simple, invisible life, but he had bought everything that mattered. Arthur's journey proves that the line between survival and salvation is often just a single, desperate choice. He sacrificed his last $18, his pride, and ultimately his quiet life to ensure his son would never know the cold again. If this gritty, high-stakes story of a father's relentless devotion kept you hooked until the very last word, hit that like button right now. Share this video to support more intense, character-driven storytelling, and make sure you subscribe so you never miss an upload. Let us know in the comments, would you have walked into that terminal?